that same money, that billions of money, would be invested into our housing stock in our local authorities instead of that one dude on his freaking mega yacht. It's just insane.
And that's the thing I always hear. It's so manipulative, but these kind of faux left wing takes on migration, like they start talking about the suppression of wages, and maybe we can ask you more openly about these sort of things. But they'll
Yeah.
use terms like the suppression of labor. I'm like, you're using Marxist language, and I know that you've never spent 2 seconds talking about automation, union crushing, none of that. Which, if there's a suppression of wage, obviously that's it. But they do this sort of thing where they try and just find, it's like a salesman who's trying to find what are the little things that make you tick. Oh, you're a bit left leaning. Okay, well, I'll talk about the suppression of wages. So suppression of wages, is there like truth to it? Is it overstated? What's like the reality of that?
Well, so in terms of like, first of all, what the studies tell us, like what is actually happening is that no, it doesn't suppress wages. It has a pretty much neutral effect on wages. But there's more complexity to it than that. The fallacy is that if there's just more workers available, then bosses can reduce wages. And if there's a scarcity of labor, then you can bargain for higher wages. That's true, but you have to have unions, you have to have organized workforce, you have to have protections for minimum standards and wages. And crucially, you all have to have the same bargaining level, right? Because if there is a group of people in the country who have fewer rights, then that group of people can be paid less. And it undermines the entire perspective of
Ah.
like bargaining for better wages. So the argument is, oh, migrants will work for less. No, that's not true. That's not true. Migrants will be paid less because we restrict migrants' rights. I want to explain this because I think it kind of comes to the crux of this. People who talk about we want less migration, they're not actually going to bring us less migration. Brexit is the perfect example, right? We have huge labor needs in this country. We have huge labor shortages and wages aren't going up. And the reason for that is that we have bad structures and weak unions to enforce workers' rights. What they're doing when they say they want to reduce migration is actually they're reducing migrants' rights. So Keir Starmer did this just the other week, his Island of Strangers speech. He said, we need less immigration. And he didn't say, I'm going to issue fewer visas. He can't say that because he needs the workers. So he said, I'm going to reduce the rights of migrants. I'm going to say that they have to be here for a longer period of time before they can become a citizen and they can have equal rights to the rest of us. So when you're on a temporary status as a migrant, before you become a citizen, you are very often tied to your employer through your visa. So most migrants who come here to work, their right to be in this country depends on their boss. So if your boss knew that you couldn't leave your job without also leaving your life in this country, then what do you think they'd do to your wages?
Oh my
Obviously,
God.
they would not raise your wages. So suppressing the rights of migrants does suppress wages.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I've not heard it. I've not heard it explained like that. Because yeah. So like the irony is they're using this argument that has a grain of truth, but not probably for the reason they think it does, to
Yeah.
argue for conditions that would worsen and make that problem more the case.
And as you say, they always stop there, don't they? They always talk about migrants. They don't talk about empowering unions. They don't talk about raising the minimum wage. They don't talk about redistribution. They don't talk about how to fund public services better. They stop at, say, blame the brown person, blame the foreigner, and then we don't have to go into the whole conversation about all the structural issues that keep wages down. So we have, even with the immigration, a scarcity of labor. That should have pushed up wages, right?
Yeah.
But by the argument that if we restrict immigration, wages will go up, the fact that there is huge vacancies and a huge need for more labor should have pushed up wages.
It's very true. I wanted to ask you, so like one of the key questions we get all the time is like about assimilation. So like the typical thing you'll hear is obviously like, I'm okay with migrants. Again, this is kind of a class thing. They're sort of talking, I'm okay with wealthy migrants, but I'm not okay with like poor migrant. They won't say that. I'm not okay with migrants from cultures I really don't understand. But what I want to ask you is two things. So can you sort of expose how actually very well integrated they are into society, firstly, but then secondly, the understand as to why there are pockets of places that are predominantly Muslim. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that, like, for the most part, Muslims are very, very integrated in the UK. You know, we have Muslims that have been British for generations and generations, like far more British families than my family, for example, which is a sort of European cocktail. Um, if you look at the UK as a whole, we're a really huge success story in terms of integration, and we had to be because we colonized half the world. So it had to be that way in the beginning, and because the in more recent times, the wave of immigration that we're seeing is like, if you want to separate out in one group, you do see Muslims and you see people from the Arab world as well, like who share some language and some cultural, and that is becoming more and more part of our culture. Obviously, we know curry's part of our culture, like these things become part of our mainstream culture, but also they become more and more over generations part of mainstream culture too. And it's just a slow process and it can be very jarring.
Yeah.
Obviously, that process is still happening, but it's also like we have less community spaces, especially among working class communities, where people just like third spaces, right? Where people go and mix and like we have less of that. We're more isolated, we're more online, we're more in our own homes now. So I think that that does have an impact on slowing that process. And the other thing is that again, like I said, like it's not immigration that lowers wages, it's the repression of the rights of migrants that lowers wages. Our immigration system makes it so much harder. Like we could have a much better approach to integration through our immigration system. What we have at the moment is that it takes, well, now the government's changing it. That was the Island of Strangers speech. It's
Mm.
going to be 10 years now before you even have a permanent status, and then another year for citizenship. And while you're othered in that way, you can't vote, you can't rely on state support, like you can't rely on any kind of benefits. If you lose your job, if you get sick, if someone in your family gets sick, if you need housing support, disability support, child support, any of that, none of that. Um, you don't get any support in terms of like what English language, any of that. That went out ages ago. So we basically have an immigration system that keeps people poorer and having a very different experience to the majority population, right? For a long time. And that obviously is bad for integration. Who'd have thought it?
Mm.
You are creating more space between those people and mainstream society. That makes the problem worse.
Is effectively, from my understanding, actually, it'd be good to get your opinion on this, is that I've heard that it's private companies that manage the distribution of the housing provisions for refugees. And
Mm.
because they're trying to turn a profit, they will go for cheaper, poorer areas. And they will not put them, you'll not see them in Chelsea, you'll not see them in Hampstead, you'll be seeing them in poor, small towns in the north. So their experience of immigration is we've randomly got plonked a bunch of people we don't know, and our high street is dying because of other economic factors that they'll probably
Yeah.
not be talked about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think that that is, I mean, this has been actually the case for a really long time. The hotels made it particularly visible. But essentially, where most asylum seekers have been housed for, oh God, when did this dispersal policy come in? Essentially, what that meant that most asylum seekers are housed in properties that are categorized as hard to let, which means like full of damp, like basically like you cannot commercially rent those places out, right? These are places that have been left to rot by developers who own them and who just are waiting on how to turn the best profit off them. And then you put, yeah, what's the cheapest way to house asylum seekers? Because you don't have to house asylum seekers on the same standard as anybody else in the country, right? The standard for housing for asylum seekers is legally lower.
That's
And
insane.
so you chuck a bunch of asylum seekers into these areas that are super deprived, that and you group them together, and the hotels has massively exacerbated that because obviously it's like these incredibly visible spaces where a bunch of people are put in and they are concentrated there, and as we've discussed, don't have anything to do, don't have any work to go to, don't have, and they are put into deprived communities who have also been poisoned, and there is like concerted efforts in these towns like of local groups to share lies about like this asylum hotel is coming and they're going to be like this and this, and obviously people like under those circumstances it's totally understandable. And this is another thing that drives me absolutely nuts because like we're told all the time that the left demonizes those people. No, I've never met anyone on the left who doesn't say I completely understand where this fear and where this resentment comes from and where those tensions grow from, because you are a very socially deprived community and then you are having a lot more poor people put suddenly into a place where like there's nothing, there's no high street, there's no services, there's no GP appointments. Obviously, that's a bad, like, it's
Yeah.
just insane. It's like, obviously, if you manage it like that, it's going to have bad outcomes. It's not the fault of the people involved on either side, frankly. And we could manage it so much better. And one of the most galling facts about this is that there's three companies that run this process, and one of them is called Clear Springs Ready Homes, and they run the most asylum hotels and these squalid, like, hard to let housing across the country. And the majority shareholder of that is a man called Graham King, and he has just entered the Sunday Times rich list. He's become a billionaire, a billionaire. And that is public money that has all gone into this one man's private little pockets to create this misery for such a huge number of people across the country. And that could be run. And there are models, like, refugee organizations have modeled this. That money, if it was given to local authorities for them to provide housing, not just for asylum seekers, decent quality housing for everybody who is homeless and who needs temporary accommodation, that same money, that billions of money, would be invested into our housing stock in our local authorities instead of that one dude on his freaking mega yacht. It's just insane. Why are we allowing this service to be privatized? It's just so incredibly destructive. And why is it? Because that guy is a donor. Like, he has been a donor in the past to the Tory party who set up that contract with him. Like, you got to look at the people with power and money in this society to understand who's actually fucking us.
Yeah, man. God damn. I think really what I'm concluding from our conversation is it's such a deeper, when we're talking about that kind of like deeper problem of the way Britain operates and sees the world, that everything's defensive and individualistic, and like we can never see humans as good. We have to see us as individuals with conflicting interests, and we're fighting each other. To me, that feels like there is like a way of using immigration and asylum, the conversation around it, to win us the moral ground. I actually really agree with what you said earlier when you said if we give this one away, if we give them that, we lose the whole game, because we have to make the moral, principled and logical and economic arguments that this is how we should start thinking as a nation, and not concede to this insane right-wing individualist attitude that is going to only work for a very small percentage of the population and is going to make your life and everyone's life worse, not just the migrant, but yours worse. We need to like win this argument.
Specifically, like, there are like just some just completely undeniable facts here. One is that we have a birth rate of 1.4%. Now, I think that there are lots of things that we can and should do to encourage and make it easier for people to have more kids. I think that that's important, and that is longer term what is necessary, right? But there is a reality here that we have the baby boomer generation. They're called the baby boomers because there's a hell of a lot of them, right? They are reaching retirement age now. They are aging out of the workforce now. And our population, even with immigration as it is going to get older and older. And that means that the dependency ratio, the number of people who are depending on working age people to pay their pension, and let's be real, older people go to the GP more often, need to spend longer periods in hospital, need to depend on social care more, and they deserve to have all of that support provided to them. They depend for that on the working age population. And it is just a demographic fact. And it is disgraceful that there is no politician willing to be totally honest about this. It is a demographic fact that we cannot provide a welfare state and pay people's pensions without immigration. It is a fact. If you want to take care of people in this country in your own self-interest, you must agree that we need immigration. And therefore, we should manage the immigration that needs to come to us well and use that. And I think that that argument has a lot of potential to talk to people, because people want to protect the elderly. People want to feel like we're protecting our welfare state, and we have allowed the argument to become more people, less room in the NHS. It's bullshit. It's just bullshit. The reason why we have an NHS under strain is because we have our population of people over the age of 85 has skyrocketed and is continuing to skyrocket. And that is good. And they deserve care in an NHS that functions. But an NHS cannot function with more and more older people unless we have also more younger people who are able to work. And the most expensive thing you ever do in your life, most people on average in the UK in terms of the NHS, is be born. And you just take that away when it's
Yeah.
migrants, right?
Yeah, politically on a persuasive level, the thing that I think people like about Trump Farage is that they felt that they were talking talking to people like they were adults. They were like,
Mm.
your lives are getting worse. They were lying about the solutions, the reasons, blah blah blah. But they at least addressed and acknowledged reality for a lot of people's lives. That it
Yeah,
has
yeah,
got
yeah.
worse. And I think
Instead of saying like, no, 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 we need to keep things as they are, it's working fine.
yeah.
It's all going to trickle down
That drives
eventually.
people insane. And I think the anti-immigrant crowd is going to be the exact same at some point, because that's going to be the new insane gaslighting. Because you are right. It's like, just factually, the demographic cannot sustain the older people. And unless you really, really, really want to make the world where older people just fuck you, go die. If you want to make that argument, fine. I think a lot of people are not going to be compelled by that.